This is Rishabh Rajan for Ask.Audio, reviewing the Korg Volca NuBass, the first vacuum tube-based synthesizer from Korg. So this uses the 6P1 new tube that Korg and Noritake developed and announced back in 2015. The NuBass uses 6 batteries and has the exact same form factor as all the other Volca series devices. Connectivity and power options are also just like the other Volcas. It does take a little bit longer than usual to boot up. It has this Vegas mode style display, but eventually it does power on and it's ready to use. So this is a monophonic synth with a single oscillator and a sub-oscillator. There are 2 tubes in here. One is for the main oscillator and the second is for the saturation stage on the sub-oscillator. You will notice as I adjust the level and the saturation, the tubes do change their brightness. So when I adjust the sub-oscillator level, the entire element gets brighter. And when I adjust the saturation, you can see that little element on the right gets brighter. Alright, so I plugged the headphone out, so let's go ahead and listen to this vacuum tube-based synthesizer. Now Korg already has a bass synth in the Volca series, the Volca bass. That one is a 3 oscillator synth with 3 individual pitch controls, whereas this one is just a single oscillator synth with 1 pitch control. There is a sub-oscillator, but that is linked to the main oscillator. So the main selling point of this synth here is the 2 tubes. One that oscillates to produce the main oscillator sound, and the second that introduces saturation on the sub-oscillator. We'll listen to this in a second. So that's the main oscillator section, or the vacuum tube oscillator. Next is the filter section. It's a ladder filter design with cutoff and resonance controls here. You do get an envelope to modulate the cutoff, and there are controls over here with the attack, envelope amount, and decay. This accent here is for the sequencer. There's also an LFO, and you can access the LFO rate and LFO amount by holding down function and twisting these 2 dials. And then over here is the master section where we have overall drive control, tone control to make the overall sound duller or brighter, tempo and swing control for the sequencer, and a master volume control. So the synth has a 16-step sequencer, just like the other Volca series synths. You can real-time record or step record. If I hold on this memory button here, we can access the 16 sequencer presets. I believe there are 10 preloaded sequences and the remaining 6 are blank. Let's load in one of these. So to run it, I'll just hit the play button. And that's the built-in sequence. Again, very similar to any of the other Volca series devices. You can step record, transpose individual steps, add accents, slides, and even randomize all of the above. Alright, so let's now listen to this tube oscillator. So this is the sawtooth tone. Now one thing you'll notice is that I'm holding down the note, but the sound has died out. So how do we control this? Unfortunately, there isn't a VCA section that's accessible. Clearly there is an envelope on the amp, as you can hear that decay, but we don't get control over it. There's a decay control here, I can increase that, but it doesn't change the decay time here. This decay here is for the envelope that's modulating the filter cutoff. So it's a bit strange how we don't have access to the amp envelope. Anyway, let's listen to the sawtooth tone. I'm going to make sure everything else is disabled. So this is as clean as it gets. You can pitch it down here. That's the lowest note. Pitch it up to the highest note. We can change the waveform from a sawtooth to a square. So clearly it's not a pure square wave. Has a very milky vibe to it. Now if you notice any tuning issues, just don't play any notes on the synth for about 10 seconds and then the synth will just auto-tune itself. So that's a pretty handy feature. I also noticed that we don't have to leave the synth on for too long to warm up the tubes. It sounds good right off the bat. Now the sawtooth and square waveform doesn't look or sound like either. I noticed that with the drive all the way down, it actually attenuates frequencies from the waveform. So if I increase the drive here just a little bit, maybe up to about the halfway mark, now we start to hear more tonality of the waveform, and it's starting to sound a lot more like a square wave here. Let's switch over to the sawtooth. Yes, that sounds a little bit more pure to me. Now you can crank up the drive all the way to the maximum, and that really overdrives the circuitry, and that also sounds pretty decent. It's still very subtle, it's not completely destroying the waveform, so don't expect any extreme distortion effects from this synth. Just that very natural analog style tube bass distortion. Alright, let's now introduce the sub bass oscillator. I'll increase the level here. Nice. Thickens up the sound. Let's bring in some saturation. You can hear that enhances the upper harmonics on that sub bass. Just makes the sound a lot thicker, especially on the lower end there. Let's try the other waveform. That's without. You really miss it when it's not there. Alright, let's now hear it with the master drive as well. So the main oscillator along with the saturated sub oscillator going through the master drive cranked up to the maximum. So that's the VTO or vacuum tube oscillator on the Volca NuBass. So let's now listen to the filter. So this is completely clean without any resonance. Let's hear the sawtooth. Pretty smooth, clean sound there on this filter. Let's try it with the resonance up. That adds a lot of character. Let's try this at a lower octave. Or higher. Let's make it more gnarly by adding in a bit more resonance. All the way to the maximum. Now this is where the NuBass really shines. When it comes to creating those acid-like tones, just up the resonance, play around with the filter cutoff, and you're pretty much there. Let's hear this with one of the sequences. So as you can hear, very easy to get those TB303 style acid bass lines. Alright, let's now check out the filter envelope. I have the filter cutoff set at the center, and I want to modulate that, so I'll increase this dial. And now we can hear the envelope modulation. Attack and decay controls here. Now if you notice, when I hold down a note, eventually the sound does die out. Again, because of the VCA being controlled by an envelope which has some decay, but we don't have control over it. But if you play relatively short notes, you're not going to notice that at all. Let's hear it with the sequencer again. Alright, so as I mentioned, there's also an LFO here. So let's listen to that, but first I'll disable the envelope modulation. So now I can hold down this function dial and twist this dial to increase the LFO modulation amount. Now what it affects, you can control by tapping any of these buttons here. So right now it's affecting pitch. Let's hear that. It's very slow, so let's increase the speed of the LFO. You can clearly hear the LFO is a square shape, but again I can change that here to a triangle. So we can add vibrato now. Let's hear this with the sequence. Can be a bit more subtle with this, but we can also crank up that LFO rate. As you can hear, it does go into audio rate. Let's try modulating the filter cutoff instead. Let's slow the LFO back down again. So a standard cutoff modulation here with the LFO. I'll change the waveform back to a square. Alright, so that's filter cutoff modulation. And lastly, we can also modulate the overall amp with the LFO. Let's change the waveform back to a triangle. Now this LFO is free running right now, but we have an option to re-trigger the LFO every time it receives a new gate. So now we can get a bit more consistent sound. So that's pretty much the synth. Of course, the sequencer has a lot of functionality as well. Let's check out some of that. I'll first disable the LFO modulation. Let's add some envelope modulation here on the filter cutoff. I'm going to hold down function and tap 11 here. So now we have a blank sequence, and let's go ahead and record a pattern. So we can do real-time recording. Just hit record and then hit play. This can be a bit tricky because there is no timing reference. Let's delete that and try again. If you made a mistake, you can choose undo as well, as you can see here. But I do plan to delete, so I'll go ahead and delete that. So now when I hit play, the sequence is blank. Let's go ahead and record in step record mode. So I'll hold down function and hit the record button. Now we're in step record mode. So I'll go ahead and record the individual steps. If I want to add rests, I can just hit the step record button. So I have a maximum of 16 possible steps. All right, let's get out of step record mode and listen to the pattern. I can increase the overall accent level, and then I can tap accent and add accents to individual steps. It's only going to work if there is a note on that step. We can add slides, so you get that nice legato sound. We can transpose individual steps, in octaves that is. So if you tap and hold, it goes down an octave. But if you just tap once, it goes up an octave. When the LED is blinking, you know it's an octave below. Now all these controls can be randomized. So if I hold down function and tap any of these three buttons, I can randomize the slide, randomize accents, and even transpose. There's step mode here, where we can enable and disable individual steps. Then there's the active step option, where we can remove individual steps. So I've removed these last 4 steps, so now it's just a 12-step sequence. I can also remove steps in between the sequence. And that will also shorten the overall pattern. There's a sequencer tempo control here. Probably one of the coolest features on the sequencer is a motion recording option, and it's very straightforward to use. Once enabled, all you have to do is hit the record button and tweak a dial. And now I've just automated that pitch dial. Let's do the same for saturation here. How about the sub-oscillator level? Now we need to hit the record button again, because every time it records a motion sequence, it turns off the record button. So let me record that saturation. Alright, now all three have been recorded. Let's do filter cutoff. Nice. Resonance. You can always redo it as well. So pretty much all these controls can be recorded in the motion sequencer. The only thing that cannot be recorded in the motion sequence are these controls over here. So the master drive, tone, volume, and tempo. So that's the Volca NuBass vacuum tube synthesizer. Now it may seem a bit gimmicky to have a tube in a synthesizer, but I would say it works pretty well. You're not going to get the same sound from the Volca bass. There's definitely a lot more character on this synth thanks to that new tube. Regarding the drive option, they could have done something to give it a bit more crunch to get some really extreme distorted bass sounds. And of course, not having any amp control is also a bit odd. Maybe the amp could have just been in gate mode instead of having this odd short decay. But aside from that, I think this bass synth works pretty well and is worth adding on to your collection of Volca synths. Alright, I hope you found this review useful. This is Rishabh Rajan for Ask.Audio signing off, and I'll see you in the next one.